woke up at 2:47 a.m., not to a sound, but to a smell. It was thick, oily, and tasted like rotten eggs. My house, my sanctuary on the edge of the Atlantic, was filling with gas. I stumbled down to the kitchen in the pitch black, my legs heavy as lead, and found the source. My vintage 6-burner stove was hissing like a viper. All 4 knobs were turned fully to on, but there was no flame. But when I reached out to turn them off, I felt something that stopped my heart cold. A piece of Scotch tape had been placed over the safety mechanism. This wasn't an accident. Someone had broken in while I slept to turn my home into a bomb. And when I pulled up the hidden security camera footage 5 minutes later, I didn't see a stranger in a mask. I saw my own son. On the screen, he didn't fumble with the lock. He didn't use a flashlight. He moved with the fluid, arrogant confidence of someone who had grown up in this house, someone who knew exactly which floorboards creaked and which ones were silent. He was wearing a dark raincoat, wet from the storm, but he didn't wipe his feet. He walked straight to the stove. He didn't hesitate. He reached out with gloved hands, turned the knobs with practiced precision, one by one. I watched, horrified, as he pulled a small roll of tape from his pocket, tore off a strip with his teeth, and applied it to the front knob. He stood there for 10 seconds, surveying his work, checking the angles and making sure the gas flow was sufficient. Then he turned back toward the door, and for a split second, the green light of the microwave caught his profile. The phone almost slipped from my hand. It wasn't a burglar. It wasn't a stranger looking for jewelry or cash. It was Caleb. My oldest son. The boy whose tuition I had paid by scrubbing floors until my knees bled. The boy I had nursed through chicken pox, whose nightmares I had chased away, and who I had tucked into bed in the room upstairs for 18 years. He hadn't broken in to steal my television. He had broken in to erase his mother. I watched him slip back out the door, locking it behind him with his key, the key I had given him for emergencies, and leaving me alone in the dark to die. I stood there in the gas-filled kitchen, shivering violently, unable to process the magnitude of what I was seeing. My brain tried to reject it. It tried to say, no, that's not possible. That's your baby. He loves you. But the video didn't lie. The smell of gas didn't lie. The tape on the knob didn't lie. 17 minutes later, the phone in my hand vibrated, the sudden buzz making me jump and nearly drop it. I looked at the screen. Caleb. He was calling at 2:47 in the morning, exactly enough time for him to drive back to his condo in the city, get into bed, and pretend to wake up. I stared at his name. A name I had picked out with Gerald 35 years ago, a name that used to mean joy. Now it looked like a threat. I debated not answering. I debated calling the police right then and there. But something, an instinct for survival I didn't know I had, told me to answer. I needed to know what he was going to say. I needed to hear the lie. I slid the icon to answer and held the phone to my ear, forcing my breathing to slow down. Hello? My voice sounded ragged, weak. Mom? His voice came through the line, a masterclass in deception. It was thick with fake sleep, groggy and dripping with manufactured concern. Hey, I know this is weird and I'm sorry to call so late, but I just woke up with the strangest feeling. A really bad feeling. Are you okay? I can't shake this sense that something's wrong. The audacity of it took my breath away. He was establishing his alibi in real time. He was creating a digital record of his concern so that when the firefighters found my charred body in the rubble tomorrow morning, he would look like the devoted son who had sensed danger through some mystical bond, rather than the arsonist who had lit the fuse. I looked at the stove, looked at the tape I had peeled off, and looked at the paused video of him standing in my kitchen. I'm fine, Caleb, I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I couldn't sleep. Everything is fine. There was a pause on the line, a hesitation, as though he was disappointed and wondering why I wasn't dead yet. He was wondering why he didn't hear the roar of flames or the panic in my voice. "Are you sure?" he pressed, his voice tightening just a fraction. "You sound off. Maybe I should come over and check on you, just to be safe." "No," I said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "No, don't come out in this storm. I'm fine, just a bad dream. Go back to sleep, honey." "Okay," he said slowly, the mask of the loving sun slipping back into place. "Okay, Mom. Love you. Call me if you need anything." "I will," I whispered. I hung up and dropped the phone onto the table as if it were burning me. I didn't sleep for a single second that night. Instead, I pulled a kitchen chair away from the table and sat there in the dark, clutching my phone like it was a lifeline, waiting for the sun to bleed through the blinds. I sat there while the house creaked and settled, trying to trace the thread back to the beginning. I was desperate to understand how we had gotten here. How had the sweet boy I raised, the boy who used to cry if he accidentally stepped on a bug, the boy who used to make me Mother's Day cards with macaroni and glitter, become a man capable of methodically planning his own mother's execution? Because if this was real, and the gas in my lungs told me it was, then what else had I missed? What other accidents had I blamed on myself when they were actually him? My mind started racing backward through the last few months, re-examining every moment of confusion, every illness, and every misplaced item. I'd been feeling strange for weeks. Headaches that wouldn't quit, dull, throbbing aches behind my eyes that made it hard to focus. Nausea every morning that left me weak and shaking over the toilet. Confusion, fogginess, and moments where I'd forget where I put my keys or lose the thread of a conversation in the middle of a sentence. I told myself I was getting older. I told myself it was just stress or grief or the slow decline that everyone expects from a widow in her 60s. Caleb had certainly encouraged that line of thinking. "Mom, you're forgetting things again," he'd say with a pitying smile. "Maybe you should see a doctor about your memory," he would say. But sitting there in the kitchen, shivering in my nightgown, a new, terrifying thought took root. What if it wasn't age? What if it wasn't nature? I remembered 6 weeks ago. I'd woken up with a splitting headache that felt like someone was driving nails through my skull. My stomach had churned so badly I couldn't stand up. I had thought I had the flu. Then my neighbor Helen had knocked on my door. I remembered dragging myself downstairs to answer it, dizzy and disoriented. Helen had looked at me with wide, worried eyes. She told me her carbon monoxide detector had gone off that morning, and since our houses were connected to the same old gas line, she wanted to make sure mine was working. She had walked into my hallway and pressed the test button on my detector. Silence. She pressed it again. Nothing. She had pulled the cover off the detector. It was empty. No batteries. At the time, I had been mortified. I had apologized profusely, blaming my own forgetfulness. I assumed I had taken them out to silence a low battery chirp and forgotten to replace them. Helen had scolded me gently, helped me put new ones in, and the incident was forgotten. But sitting there in the dark, I realized I had actually replaced them. I remembered buying a pack of batteries at the hardware store, remembered standing on a chair and putting them in. And I remembered doing it the same day Caleb came over for dinner. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was a Tuesday. Caleb had come over for pot roast. He had been charming and helpful, pouring the wine and asking about the business. It was a warm night for the season, but he had worn his heavy wool peacoat. When he left, he had forgotten the coat in the closet. He'd texted me later saying, "Oops, left my coat. Keep it there, I'll grab it next time." It had been hanging in my front closet for 3 weeks now. I stared at the closet door across the hallway. The white paint seemed to glow in the shadows. I forced myself to stand up. My legs were stiff and my body aching from the tension. But I walked across the kitchen floor, the silence of the house pressing in on me. Outside, the wind howled off the Atlantic, rattling the sash windows like a ghost trying to get in. In these old Gloucester houses, you get used to the noises, the settling of the timber, the groan of the pipes. But tonight, every sound felt like a threat. I realized with a sick feeling that the isolation I had always loved about this house, tucked away on a rocky bluff overlooking the water, was now my greatest vulnerability. If I screamed, the ocean wind would carry the sound away before it ever reached a neighbor. I reached the closet door and opened it. The smell of wool and stale tobacco drifted out. Caleb's heavy navy peacoat still hung there, innocent and dark. The house was so quiet I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, a whoosh whoosh sound that matched the beat of my terrified heart. I reached into the deep wool pocket of his coat, my fingers trembling. I felt lint, some loose change, and then my fingers brushed against two cold, heavy, cylindrical objects. I closed my hand around them and pulled them out into the dim hallway light. 2 AA batteries. They were still sealed in their plastic blister pack. They were the exact brand, the exact size missing from the hollow detector on my wall. I stared at them, breathing in the scent of his coat, and realized with sickening clarity what must have happened. He hadn't forgotten the coat. He had left it there on purpose. As I stared at the sealed package, the brilliance of his cruelty hit me. If I had died of carbon monoxide poisoning that week, and the police found this coat, Caleb wouldn't have been arrested. He would have been pitied. He would have pointed to these batteries and sobbed, "I bought them to fix her detector." I went over there to help her, but I must have gotten distracted and forgot to put them in. It was a tragic accident. The sealed batteries weren't a mistake. They were his alibi. He had removed the old batteries to ensure the gas would kill me, but he had left the new ones here to prove he tried to save me. He hadn't just left a coat in my closet. He had planted the evidence of his own innocence. I sank to the floor, clutching the batteries to my chest, and finally, the tears came. Not tears of sadness, but tears of horror. My son had been poisoning me for weeks. The headaches, the nausea, the dementia, it was all carbon monoxide poisoning. He had been slowly suffocating me in my own home, waiting for me to die naturally so he could inherit everything without a fight. And when that was too slow, when I didn't die fast enough, he had come back tonight to finish the job with the stove. I sat there until dawn, watching the gray light filter into the hallway, and made a promise to the woman I used to be. I was done being the victim. I was done being the confused old lady they wanted me to be. I was going to survive this, and then I was going to make them pay. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table until the sun began to bleed through the blinds, clutching those stolen batteries in my hand like they were evidence of a crime I couldn't yet name. To understand why this betrayal broke me, and why finding those batteries felt like finding a knife in my back, you have to understand what it was that they were trying to steal. You have to understand that Emerson's table wasn't just a business. It was a resurrection. 30 years ago, the smell of yeast and salt air at 4 a.m. meant hope. I was standing in the kitchen of what would become our legacy, though back then it was just a drafty, cramped storefront near the docks in Gloucester. The wind off the Atlantic rattled the single-pane windows, and the floorboards groaned under my feet. But to Gerald and me, it was a palace. We had poured our life savings, $3,000 hidden in a coffee can, into a used stove and 50 pounds of flour, banking everything on the idea that fishermen coming off the night shift needed something warmer than whiskey to thaw their bones. I remember that first morning vividly. The fog was so thick you couldn't see the harbor, just the yellow beams of the lighthouse cutting through the gray. Gerald was humming that off-key melody he always hummed when he was nervous and cracking eggs into a dented metal bowl while I kneaded dough until my forearms burned. We opened the doors at 6. By 6:15, we had our first customer, Wade, a trucker with gentle eyes and hands the size of dinner plates. He ordered the fisherman's special: eggs, home fries, and a fresh baked scone still steaming from the oven. I watched him take that first bite, holding my breath until his eyes closed, and he whispered that it tasted like his grandmother's kitchen. That was the moment I knew we were going to survive. We weren't just selling breakfast, we were selling warmth in a cold town. Gerald framed our first $10 bill and hung it on the wall next to the register, writing "The Dream" on the mat in his messy script. Over the next 20 years, Emerson's Table grew from that single drafty storefront into a legendary Massachusetts landmark. We opened 3 locations across the North Shore, were featured in Yankee Magazine, and we won Best Clam Chowder 5 years in a row. But more importantly, we built a life. We raised Caleb and Eli in those kitchens. They did their homework at Table 4, learned to walk on the sawdust-covered floors, and grew up smelling like flour and fryer grease, surrounded by a community that loved them because they were ours. When Gerald died 15 years ago, I thought the dream would die with him. But I kept cooking. I kept the chowder thick and the rolls fresh, and I kept making people feel like family because that's what Gerald would have wanted. Then, 8 years ago, Caleb and Eli came home. They had gone off to Boston University on tuition I paid for with overtime shifts. They came back wearing tailored suits and speaking a language I didn't recognize. They didn't talk about hospitality or community. They talked about scaling, franchising, and margins. They looked at my cozy, wood-paneled diners and saw potential assets to be stripped and modernized. I was so proud of them, though, and was blinded by a mother's pride. I thought, look at my boys. Look how smart they are. They want to help their mama. I didn't see the wolves because they were wearing my children's faces. The trap was sprung on a freezing Tuesday night in November of 2012. It was the night I made the single biggest mistake of my life, though I wouldn't realize exactly how much of a cage I had walked into until 6 years later. Caleb asked me to come into the city to the new corporate office they had set up in the Seaport District, a glass and steel box that cost more in rent each month than I used to make in a year. The weather that night was vicious. A sleet storm was battering the harbor, turning the windows into sheets of gray ice and sealing us in. I arrived shivering, shaking the wet snow from my coat, and feeling out of place in the sterile, minimalist office. Caleb sat behind a massive mahogany desk, flanked by Eli and 2 investors in charcoal suits who didn't offer to take my coat. The heating system rattled overhead, fighting a losing battle against the chill coming off the water, but the real cold was coming from my son. "Mom, we need to handle some housekeeping," Caleb said, his voice smooth and hypnotic as the storm howled outside. He slid a stack of documents across the desk. They smelled of fresh toner and legal complexity. "It's just a corporate restructuring," he explained, tapping the paper with a manicured finger. "To protect you from liability if someone sues the company for a slip and fall, we don't want them coming after your house. This just moves the assets into a holding company and changes nothing about your day-to-day. You're still the boss." I looked at the papers. The text was dense, tiny, and filled with words like indemnification and assignment of rights. I hesitated. A voice in my head, Mama's voice, whispered, "Read it, Ruth. Read every word." But the investors were checking their watches. Eli was smiling that sweet, boyish smile I loved and nodding encouragingly. Caleb looked stressed, like he was carrying the weight of the world for me. "We need this signed tonight to file before the quarter ends," Caleb pressed gently. "Trust me, Mom. We're doing this to protect you. To protect me." I looked at my sons. I thought about the tuition checks, thought about the nights I sat up with them when they were sick, and thought about how much I loved them. So I picked up the pen. I remember my hand hovering over the signature line and the pen shaking slightly, while the wind screamed against the glass like a warning I was too tired to hear. I signed. I signed my name 15 times, and with each stroke of the pen, I unknowingly slit the throat of the business Gerald and I had built. Now, sitting in my kitchen 6 years later, holding the batteries that proved my son wanted me dead, I finally understood what those papers really meant. The carbon monoxide wasn't just about killing me, it was about rushing the inheritance and closing the loop on a theft that had started that night in the storm. I needed to know the truth. I waited until 8 a.m., then I called my friend Diane. Diane was a bulldog of a lawyer I'd known since our kids played Little League together. I told her I needed to see the incorporation documents from 2012, the ones Caleb had filed after that meeting. "Why, Ruth?" she asked, her voice sharp with worry. "What's wrong?" "Just bring them," I said. "Please." 2 hours later, Diane showed up at my door. She didn't waste time with pleasantries or small talk. She walked into my kitchen, her face grim, and slid a folder across the table. "I pulled the filings from the Secretary of the Commonwealth," she said quietly. "Ruth, did you read what you signed?" "He said it was restructuring," I whispered. "To protect me." Diane flipped the folder open and pointed to a paragraph buried deep in the dense legal terminology of page 42. Her finger trembled slightly. "It wasn't restructuring," she said. "It was an abdication." I looked at the words. They seemed to swim before my eyes, but the phrases jumped out at me like physical blows. Irrevocable transfer of controlling interest and majority board authority. "You didn't just move assets," Diane explained, her voice thick with pity. "You signed away 70% of the company to Caleb and Eli. You reclassified your own shares as Class B, non-voting stock. Ruth, you have no say in the company. You haven't for 6 years. They can sell it, strip it, or bankrupt it, and you can't stop them." The air left the room. I hadn't just signed a paper. I had handed them the knife. For 6 years, I had been walking around thinking I was the owner, thinking I was in charge, while they laughed behind my back and waited for me to die so they could cash out the rest. "Can I undo it?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Diane shook her head slowly. "It's a valid contract. Unless you can prove fraud or duress, and that's nearly impossible after 6 years, it stands. They own it, Ruth." Rage is a funny thing. It doesn't always feel hot. In that moment, it felt colder than the Gloucester Harbor in February. It felt like ice water in my veins. I thanked Diane and walked her to the door. Then I grabbed my keys. I drove into Boston that morning, navigating the aggressive traffic of the Big Dig tunnels with a singular, cold focus. The city's skyline loomed ahead, gray and imposing, but I didn't feel the usual anxiety I felt driving in the city. I felt nothing but target fixation. I parked in the garage under their building, my building, paid for with my chowder, and took the elevator to the 20th floor. The receptionist was new. She was young, polished, and had no idea who I was. When I tried to walk past the desk, she stood up, blocking my path. "Ma'am, you can't go back there," she said, her voice dripping with that specific politeness people use on the elderly. "Do you have an appointment?" "I don't need an appointment," I said, my voice steady. "I'm Ruth Emerson. I built this company." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Emerson," she said, glancing at a list on her desk. "But Caleb, Mr. Huff Emerson, is in a meeting. He left strict instructions. No interruptions." "Strict instructions," I repeated. I looked at the glass doors behind her. I could see them in the conference room. Caleb was standing at the head of the table, pointing at a projection screen. Eli was laughing at something an investor said. They looked so comfortable, so safe. I didn't argue with the girl. I simply stepped around her. She reached for the phone to call security, but I was already moving. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the conference room. The heavy thud of the door hitting the stopper echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. Conversation stopped instantly. Caleb froze mid-gesture, looked at me, and for a split second, I saw the panic flash in his eyes. The same panic I'd seen on the security footage when he was turning the stove knobs. "Mom?" he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. What are you doing here? We're in the middle of a... I threw the folder Diane had given me onto the mahogany table. It slid across the polished surface and stopped right in front of him. I know, I said. The silence in the room was absolute. I know about the Class B shares. I know about the transfer of control. I know you stole it. The investors looked uncomfortable, shifting in their expensive chairs. Eli looked down at his shoes, unable to meet my gaze. But Caleb didn't flinch. He slowly closed the folder and looked at me with an expression of weary patience, like he was dealing with a tantruming child. Mom, he said, his voice smooth, reasonable, gaslighting me in front of an audience. We've discussed this. You're confused again. We went over this 6 years ago. You wanted to step back. You wanted to retire. We're just honoring your wishes. I never wanted to retire, I shouted, the anger finally cracking my voice. I wanted to build this with you. I trusted you. Caleb stood up, walked around the table and took my arm, his grip firm, guiding me toward the door. Gentlemen, excuse us, he said to the room. My mother hasn't been herself lately. The doctors are very concerned about her memory. He dragged me into the hallway, the heavy door clicking shut behind us. The moment we were alone, his face changed. The concerned son vanished, replaced by something hard and ugly. He didn't let go of my arm. Don't ever do that again, he hissed, leaning down so his face was inches from mine. You come in here, embarrassing me in front of equity partners? Do you have any idea how fragile these deals are? You stole my company, I said, pulling my arm free. You tricked me. We saved it, he snapped. You were running it like a charity, Mom. Giving away food, keeping dead weight staff. We turned it into an empire. We did what had to be done. And the batteries? I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. The stove? Was that doing what had to be done too? He froze. His eyes narrowed, searching my face. For a moment, I thought he was going to hit me. Then he smiled. It was a terrifying, empty smile. Go home, Ruth, he said softly. Take your pills, take a nap, and stop imagining monsters where there are only businessmen. You're tired, and tired people make mistakes. Dangerous mistakes. He turned and walked back into the conference room, leaving me standing alone in the hallway of the company I built, realizing that the theft of the business was just the beginning. They had taken my livelihood. Now they were coming for my life. I drove home in a daze, the reality settling over me like a shroud. I had no power and I had no company. And if Caleb had his way, I wouldn't have a pulse for much longer. But I didn't know yet that the business was just the beginning. I thought they were just greedy men stealing a company. I didn't realize that while they were taking my livelihood, they were also putting plans in motion to take my life. I drove home from that confrontation in Boston, feeling like the ground beneath my feet had turned to quicksand. I had lost my company, my son had laughed in my face, and in the silence of my car, a terrifying question began to take root in my mind. What if he's right? Gaslighting is a precise form of torture. It doesn't just make you doubt the liar, it makes you doubt your own senses. And the terrifying truth was that for the last 2 months, I had been confused. It wasn't just forgetfulness. It was a fog that settled over my brain every evening when I sat in my living room, a lethargy that made my limbs feel like lead, and a pounding headache that started at the base of my skull every night around 6 p.m. and didn't lift until I left the house the next morning. I thought about the night 3 weeks ago when I had driven to the grocery store, a trip I had made 1,000 times before. I had turned onto Atlantic Road, the main coastal route I knew by heart, and suddenly nothing looked familiar anymore. The street signs seemed to be written in a foreign language. The landmarks, the old lighthouse, the lobster shack, all looked wrong. I had pulled over to the side of the road, gripping the steering wheel, and hyperventilating, convinced I had driven into a different town. It took 10 minutes for the world to snap back into focus. I sat there crying, terrified that the dementia that took my grandmother was coming for me. But now, armed with the knowledge of the batteries and the stove, I realized the horror wasn't inside my brain. It was in the air I was breathing. Caleb hadn't just stolen the business. He was systematically poisoning me to create a medical history of decline. He was manufacturing a crazy old woman narrative so that when I finally died or tried to speak up, my credibility would already be shredded. I needed to know how far it went and what was in my official medical files. I waited until Tuesday morning, then I called the office of Dr. Reynolds, my primary care physician of 15 years. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number. Dr. Reynolds' office? This is Olivia, a chirpy voice answered. Hi, Olivia. This is Ruth Emerson, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I need to make an appointment for a checkup. I've been having some headaches. There was a pause on the line, and the sound of typing stopped. Mrs. Emerson? Olivia's voice changed. It dropped an octave, taking on that slow, patient tone people use when speaking to a confused child. You want another appointment? Yes, I said. It's been a while since my physical. Oh, sweetie, she said, and the pity in her voice made my skin crawl. You were just here, don't you remember? I gripped the phone tighter. No, Olivia, I haven't been there in 6 months. I'm looking at your chart right now, she said gently. You were here 2 weeks ago, March 3rd, for a cognitive evaluation. Your son Caleb brought you in. You were having a rough day. Dr. Reynolds referred you to a neurologist for memory testing. The room spun. March 3rd, I looked at the calendar on my wall. I remembered March 3rd vividly. It was the day of the nor'easter. A massive storm had dumped 2 feet of snow on Gloucester. The plows hadn't even cleared my street until the next afternoon. I hadn't left my house for 48 hours. I had spent the entire day reading by the fire and calling the restaurant to make sure the pipes didn't freeze. It was physically impossible for me to have been at a doctor's office in Boston that day. Olivia? I said, my voice hardening. That is impossible. I was snowed in on March 3rd. I never left my house. Mrs. Emerson, she sighed, exasperated now. I checked you in myself. You were wearing that lovely navy wool coat. You signed the forms. Caleb was holding your arm. You seemed very confused. You kept asking where Gerald was. Gerald, my husband who had been dead for 15 years. They hadn't just faked a visit. They had scripted a performance. They had staged a scene of a senile widow looking for her dead husband to cement the diagnosis. I need to speak to Dr. Reynolds, I said. Now. He's with a patient? Get him on the phone or I'm coming down there with the police, I snapped. 5 minutes later, Dr. Reynolds came on the line. He sounded worried. Ruth, Olivia tells me you're upset. I wasn't there, David, I said, using his first name. On March 3rd, I wasn't there. Caleb is lying to you. Ruth, he said gently, I sat with you for 30 minutes. We did the mini mental state exam. You scored a 19. That suggests moderate cognitive impairment. I know this is hard to accept. Anosognosia, or lack of insight, is a common symptom of the disease, but we need to face this. Check the signature, I demanded. Pull the HIPAA forms I supposedly signed that day, and check the signature against my file from last year. I really don't think that's necessary. Check it, I screamed. I heard the rustle of papers. Silence stretched out for a long, agonizing minute. Huh, he said softly. What? It's similar, he murmured, but the pressure is wrong. You press hard on the downstrokes. This looks traced, shaky. And check your security cameras, I said, pushing my advantage. If I was there, I'm on tape. I can't just access security footage without a reason, Ruth. The reason is identity theft, I shouted. The reason is fraud. My son hired someone to impersonate me. Dr. Reynolds was silent for a long time. I'll look into it, he said finally. I'll call you back. When he called back 4 hours later, his voice was shaken. He didn't sound like a doctor anymore. He sounded like a man who had seen a ghost. I watched the lobby footage, he said quietly. A woman came in with Caleb. She was wearing a navy coat. She had gray hair, and she walked with a cane. I don't use a cane, David, I whispered. I know, he said. When I zoomed in, it wasn't you. She looked like you from a distance. But the nose was different. The jawline. Ruth? Who is that woman? I don't know, I said, tears of rage finally spilling over. But I know who paid her. My son had hired an actress. He had found someone, maybe from a local theater group, maybe a professional impersonator, and paid her to put on a wig, limp into a doctor's office, and pretend to be his demented mother. He had created a verified medical paper trail that said Ruth Emerson was losing her mind. If I had died of carbon monoxide poisoning the next week, and the police asked questions, Caleb would pull out these records. She was confused, he would say. She probably left the stove on by accident. Look, the doctor diagnosed her with dementia just last week. It was the perfect murder, and it would have worked if I hadn't woken up to the smell of gas. The weight of it all, the stolen business, the gas in my lungs, the fake doctor, and the sheer magnitude of the hatred my sons held for me, finally became too much for my body to bear. 2 days later, on a raw Thursday morning, my body simply shut down. I woke up at 4 a.m., not to the smell of gas this time, but to a sensation of crushing pressure. It felt as if a giant hand had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart into a fist. I tried to sit up, but the room spun violently. A wave of nausea hit me, and I collapsed back onto the pillows. My left arm felt heavy, useless, dead. This is it, I thought. They won. I gasped for air, but my lungs wouldn't fill. Pain radiated up my jaw, sharp and electric. I managed to fumble for my phone and dialed 911. Gloucester emergency, the dispatcher said. Heart, I whispered. Help. The next hour was a blur of sirens, flashing lights, and the terrified faces of EMTs hovering over me. They rushed me down the slick coastal roads to Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, bypassing the local clinic for the Cardiac Trauma Center. I remember the lights of the ER ceiling rushing past, remember them cutting my nightgown open, and I remember the cold gel of the EKG pads. And then I remember the silence of the recovery room. A doctor came in, a sharp woman with tired eyes named Dr. Miriam. She looked at my chart, then at me. Mrs. Emerson, she said, you didn't have a heart attack. Your arteries are clear. There's no blockage. But the pain, I rasped. You have Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, she said, broken heart syndrome. She explained that under extreme emotional stress, the body releases a flood of adrenaline that can stun the heart muscle, causing the left ventricle to balloon out and paralyze. It mimics a massive heart attack and can be fatal. It's caused by severe emotional trauma, she said gently. Grief, betrayal, fear. Is there stress in your life right now? I looked at the ceiling. Is there stress? My son stole my legacy, poisoned my air, and hired an imposter to steal my identity. Family trouble, I whispered. You need to reduce your stress immediately, she warned. Your heart is physically changing shape because of sadness. If you don't feel safe at home, we have social workers. Before I could answer, the door opened. Mom? Caleb stood in the doorway. He was holding a bouquet of lilies, my least favorite flower, the flower of funerals. He looked frantic, disheveled, the picture of the worried son. Oh my God, he said, rushing to the bedside. I got here as soon as they called. Are you okay? Dr. Miriam smiled at him. She's stable. She just needs rest. It's good she has family here, she said as she left us alone. The moment the door clicked shut, Caleb's posture changed. The frantic worry evaporated like mist. He didn't sit down. He stood over the bed, looking down at me with cold curiosity. Broken heart syndrome, he said, reading the chart at the foot of the bed. Poetic. Get out, I wheezed. I'm not going anywhere, he said, tossing the lilies onto the side table. I'm your medical proxy. Or did you forget you signed that too in 2012? I tried to reach for the call button, but he moved the remote just out of reach. He pulled the chair close, dragging it across the linoleum with a screech. Then he sat down and leaned in until his face was inches from mine. I could smell the coffee on his breath and the expensive cologne he had bought with my stolen money. "You look terrible, Mom," he whispered. "You're falling apart. First the memory loss, now the heart. It's almost over, isn't it?" "I know about the actress," I said, my voice weak but steady. "I know about March 3rd, and I know about the batteries." He didn't flinch. He didn't look scared. He just smiled. "And who are you going to tell?" he asked softly. "Dr. Reynolds thinks you have dementia. This hospital thinks you're fragile. You have a documented history of confusion and paranoia. If you start screaming about actresses and batteries, they won't arrest me. They'll sedate you." He patted my hand, the touch making my skin crawl. "I'm the hero in this story, Ruth," he said. "I'm the devoted son sitting by his sick mother's bedside, managing her affairs because she's too incompetent to do it herself. I've built a fortress of paper that proves you're crazy. You can't break out of it." He stood up and buttoned his jacket. "Rest up," he said cheerfully. "When you get out, we need to talk about assisted living. I found a nice facility. It has a locked memory unit. You'll be safe there." He walked out, waving to the nurse at the station as he left. I lay there in the hospital bed, the heart monitor beeping a steady rhythm beside me. He was right. He had built a fortress of lies and had turned the system against me. But he had made one mistake. He thought he had broken me. He thought broken heart syndrome meant I was finished. He didn't understand that a broken heart is like a broken bone. When it heals stronger at the fracture point. I lay there and let the rage fill the cracks in my heart and let it harden into something jagged and dangerous. I wasn't going to the memory unit. I wasn't going to die. I was going to wait until I was discharged. And then I was going to burn his fortress to the ground. The hospital released me 3 days later with a prescription for beta blockers and stern instructions to avoid stress. I drove back to Gloucester in a daze, the gray shingles of my house looking dark and unwelcoming against the slate gray sky. As I pulled into the driveway, the wind off the harbor was whipping through the yard, stripping the last dead leaves from the oak trees. It caught a piece of white paper that had been taped to my front door, fluttering it violently against the wood. It wasn't tucked discreetly into the mailbox. It was plastered right at eye level, flapping in the gale like a surrender flag. I fought the wind to tear it down, my hands numb from the cold, my eyes scanning the bold, and humiliating text. Notice of foreclosure sale. Property to be auctioned December 15th. All occupants must vacate premises. I stood on my porch, reading the words over and over. This was the house Gerald and I bought in 1997. The house where Gerald died. The house I owned, free and clear. I called the number on the paper with shaking hands. A clerk at the Essex County Registry of Deeds confirmed the nightmare in a bored and bureaucratic monotone. She told me a second mortgage had been taken out on the property for $180,000, funded by a private equity firm based in the financial district of Boston, the same district where Caleb's new office was located. "That's impossible," I told her. "I never signed a mortgage." "I have the paperwork right here, ma'am," she said. "Signed and notarized on March 14th. March 14th. The date hit me like a physical blow. March 14th was Gerald's birthday. I spent every March 14th at the cemetery, sitting by his headstone. I turned off my phone. I didn't do business. I grieved. Caleb knew that. He knew I would be unreachable. He knew I would be distracted by grief. He had used my husband's birthday as the cover to steal my husband's house. I hung up the phone, looked at the foreclosure notice, and looked at the house that was no longer mine. They had taken my business, poisoned my body, stolen my identity, and now they had taken my sanctuary. I walked inside, grabbed a duffel bag, and started packing. I wasn't going to stay here and wait for the sheriff to evict me. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me dragged out. I was going to disappear. I was going to rock bottom. And from there, I was going to start the climb back up. I couldn't stay in that house for one more night. Not with the ghost of Caleb's betrayal hanging in the hallway, not with the smell of gas still lingering in the curtains, and certainly not with the knowledge that it didn't belong to me anymore. I packed a single duffel bag with the essentials, 3 changes of clothes, my toiletries, Gerald's framed photo from the bedside table, and the box of stolen documents I had started to compile. I went to the bank and withdrew every cent I could access from an old savings account I prayed Caleb didn't know about. $4,000 in cash. Then I got in my truck and drove south. I drove until the familiar, comforting coastline of Gloucester disappeared in the rearview mirror. I drove past the wealthy suburbs of the North Shore, past the city skyline, and down the gritty stretch of Route 1. I was looking for a place that matched the desolation I felt inside. Somewhere anonymous, somewhere cheap, somewhere no one would look for the former chowder queen of the North Shore. I found it in Saugus. The Starlight Motor Inn was a fading relic from the 1970s, sitting on a cracked asphalt lot in the shadow of a massive shopping plaza. The neon sign buzzed with the angry, frantic sound of a dying insect, the letter M flickering ominously. It was the kind of place where people stayed when they had run out of options or when they didn't want to be found. I parked my truck between a rusted sedan with a flat tire and a dumpster that smelled of rotting seafood. I walked into the lobby, which smelled of stale smoke and pine sol, and paid cash to a clerk sitting behind bulletproof glass. He didn't ask for ID. He didn't ask how long I was staying. He just slid a key across the metal tray. Room 104, he grunted. Checkout is at 11. No loud noise. No guests after 10. I took the key and walked to my room. Room 104 was a tomb. The carpet was sticky, patterned with 30 years of stains. The wallpaper was peeling at the corners, revealing yellowed plaster underneath. The only window looked out onto the highway, where headlights swept across the ceiling every few seconds like searchlights. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, still wearing my coat, and looked at my hands. These were hands that had kneaded 1,000 pounds of dough, hands that had shaken hands with mayors and food critics, hands that had bathed 2 baby boys and built a multi-million-dollar business. Now, at 63 years old, these hands held nothing but a cheap motel key. I was homeless and dying of a broken heart. My sons were trying to kill me, and I was hiding in a roadside motel off Route 1. The reality of it hit me then, harder than the heart failure had. I slid off the bed onto the dirty floor, pulled my knees to my chest, and let out a sound I didn't recognize, a guttural, animal keen of grief. I cried for the house I'd lost. I cried for the husband who wasn't there to protect me. But mostly, I cried for the loss of my identity. I was no longer Ruth Emerson, the business owner. I was no longer Ruth Emerson, the beloved mother. I was just an old woman in a motel room, waiting to die. I stayed in that room for 2 days. I barely ate and stared at the ceiling, listening to the aggressive hum of the neon sign and watching the shadows lengthen and shorten. Paranoia became my roommate. Every time a car door slammed outside, I flinched, thinking it was Caleb coming to finish the job. Every time the phone in the room rang, which was always a wrong number, my heart seized. I was drowning in fear, and I was ready to let the water take me. But on the 3rd night, my cell phone buzzed against the nightstand, startling me in the silence. I stared at it. I hadn't turned it on in 48 hours. It was a text message. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was local. Mrs. Emerson? This is Nora, from the Gloucester Diner. I heard what happened. I have something you need to see. Can we meet? I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the glass. Nora, I remembered her instantly. I had hired her 3 years ago at the original diner. She was 19 then, a scrap of a girl with bleached hair and nervous eyes, looking for a job to pay for community college. She had no experience, but she had a fierceness I recognized. I had hired her on the spot, taught her how to bake the scones, and watched her grow into one of my best shift managers. But I hadn't spoken to her in 6 months. Why was she texting me now? My paranoia flared. It's a trap, a voice whispered. Caleb sent her. He knows you're alive. He's using her to find you. I typed back, how did you get this number? The response came immediately. I pulled it from the old employee emergency contact file before Caleb shredded it. Mrs. Emerson, please. I know what they're doing. I have proof. Proof. That single word hung in the air, heavy with possibility. I hesitated. If I went, I risked exposing myself. If Caleb was tracking her, he would find me. But if I stayed in this motel room, I would rot here. I typed, where? Tomorrow, 10 a.m., the 24-hour truck stop diner off I-95 near Peabody, the one with the big rig parking at the back booth. A truck stop that is public, busy, with lots of exits. I'll be there, I replied. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours cleaning myself up in the tiny, stained bathroom sink. I put on my best blouse, wrinkled now, but still dignified. Then I brushed my hair and put on lipstick. If I was going to walk into a trap, I was going to look like Ruth Emerson when I did it. I arrived at the truck stop at 9:45 a.m., 15 minutes early. I parked my truck around the back near the semi-trucks, creating a quick escape route if I needed it, then walked inside, the smell of burnt coffee and diesel fuel hitting me like a wall. I chose the booth Nora had specified, the one in the far back corner, with a view of the entire room and the front door. Then I ordered a black coffee and waited. At 10 a.m. sharp, the door opened. Nora walked in. She looked older than I remembered. Her hair was back to its natural brown, pulled into a severe ponytail. She wore a heavy coat and carried a large tote bag. She scanned the room, her eyes darting nervously until they landed on me. Her face softened. She hurried over, and before I could even stand, she slid into the booth and grabbed my hand. "Oh my God, Mrs. Emerson," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "You look, I was so worried." "I'm okay, Nora," I said, though we both knew I wasn't. "You said you have proof?" "I do," she said, glancing around the diner to make sure no one was listening. After Caleb took over corporate, things got weird. He started firing the old staff. He brought in his own people, but he kept me because I knew the scheduling software. She lowered her voice. "I saw things. He was moving money, late at night, transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, and the way he talked about you, it made me sick." She reached into her tote bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope, which she slid across the sticky Formica table. "I started copying things," she said. "Emails, invoices. He thought I was just the scheduling girl. He didn't know I still had admin access to the server." I opened the envelope. My hands shook as I pulled out the stack of papers. The first page was an email from Caleb to a supplier called Apex Ingredients. From Caleb Emerson to Apex Supply. Subject, cost reduction. Switch the butter to the oil blend immediately. I don't care if the taste changes. The old lady won't notice, and the margin increase is 12%. Just make sure the packaging looks the same. My heart broke a little. He had adulterated my recipes. The recipes Gerald and I had spent years perfecting. He was serving garbage to my customers to save pennies. But as I flipped through the pages, the betrayal turned from culinary to criminal. There were bank statements showing wire transfers, $10,000 here, $15,000 there, moving from the company operating account to a hidden shell company in Delaware called Blue Tide Holdings. "He's embezzling," I whispered. "He's draining the company." "Keep looking," Nora said grimly. I turned the page. It was a photocopy of a handwritten ledger. I recognized the jagged and impatient handwriting immediately. It was Caleb's. It looked like a budget for a project. Consulting fees. Medical, $15,000. Legal retainer. Foreclosure, $8,000. Equipment, CO $2,300. Final solution. I stared at the words CO carbon monoxide. Final solution. The air left my lungs. My son hadn't just drifted into evil. He had budgeted for my murder like it was a capital expenditure. He had assigned a dollar value to my death, written it down in a notebook, and filed it away next to the price of fryer oil. He wrote this down? I asked, my voice trembling. He's arrogant, Nora said. He thinks he's untouchable. He thinks you're gone. There's one more thing, she said. She pulled out her phone and placed it on the table between us. She opened a video file. I found this on the server backup, she said. It's from the security camera at the Boston office parking lot. The date stamp is February 28th. I watched the screen. It was night. Grainy, black and white footage. Caleb's BMW was parked under a streetlight. A woman walked into the frame. I gasped. Even in the low light, the resemblance was nauseating. She was wearing a wig styled exactly like my hair, a short, sensible gray bob. She was wearing a long navy wool coat, identical to the one I wore all winter, and she walked with a slight stoop, mimicking my posture when my arthritis acted up. Caleb got out of the car and handed her a thick envelope. She opened it, counted a stack of cash, and nodded. Then she did something that made my blood run cold. She practiced my laugh. I couldn't hear the audio, but I saw her head throw back, her hand coming up to cover her mouth exactly the way I did. It was a perfect, terrifying mimicry. Who is she? I whispered. Her name is Miranda Reeves, Nora said. I looked her up. She's a character actress, does local theater and voiceover work. Caleb hired her. To go to the doctor, I realized, to pretend to be me. And to the bank, Nora added. I found records of withdrawals made in person at branches where the tellers didn't know you well. She's been impersonating you all over town, Ruth, creating a trail of a confused, spending-happy old woman. I sat back in the booth, the enormity of it washing over me. It wasn't just gaslighting. It was identity theft on a theatrical scale. He had hired a cast and crew to destroy my life. Why are you doing this, Nora? I asked, looking at the young woman across from me. This is dangerous. If he finds out... Nora looked me dead in the eye. 3 years ago, she said, my mom got sick, real sick. I couldn't afford her meds and tuition. I was going to drop out, but you found out. You didn't say anything. You just gave me a bonus that covered everything. You told me smart girls stay in school. You saved my future, Mrs. Emerson, and I'm not going to let him steal yours. Tears pricked my eyes. I'd forgotten about all that. It was such a small thing at the time, money I could spare. But to her, it was a lifeline. I realized then that while Caleb had built an empire of money, I had built an empire of loyalty. And loyalty was the one currency he couldn't steal. Thank you, I whispered. What do we do now? Nora asked. I looked at the ledger, looked at the video of the actress, and looked at the emails. I felt the fear in my chest begin to recede, replaced by a cold, hard determination. The broken heart in my chest beat a little stronger. Now, I said, gathering the papers, we go to war, but we don't go to the police yet. They might not understand the financial complexity. We need a weapon. What kind of weapon? She asked. A lawyer. A specific kind of lawyer. One who hates bullies. I pulled out my phone and dialed Diane. Diane, I said when she answered. I need a referral. I need the meanest, sharpest, and most aggressive criminal attorney in Boston. Someone who isn't afraid of private equity money. Someone who wants to burn a predator to the ground. There was a pause on the line. I know just the woman, Diane said. Her name is Harper Boone, and she's waiting for your call. I hung up the phone and looked at Nora. Get in your car, I said. Go home and lock your doors. Don't go back to the office. I'll take it from here. And with that, I walked out of that truck stop diner with a manila envelope tucked under my arm. I walked past the truckers, past the smell of diesel, and out into the crisp Massachusetts air. I wasn't the victim in the motel room anymore. I was Ruth Emerson, and I was about to introduce my sons to the consequences of their actions. I called Harper Boone from the cab of my truck, parked in the shadows of the truck stop lot while Nora drove away in her sedan. My hands were still shaking from the meeting, but my voice was steady. My name is Ruth Emerson. I told the receptionist who answered. I was referred by Diane Miller. I have evidence of multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement, identity theft, and attempted murder, and I need to see Miss Boone today. There was a muffled conversation on the other end, and then a sharp, clear voice came on the line. This is Harper. Can you be in Boston in an hour? I'll be there, I said. I drove into the city, the skyline of Boston rising up like a fortress of glass and steel against the gray sky. I didn't feel like the victim who had been hiding in a motel room anymore. I felt like a woman bringing a storm to shore. Harper Boone's office was located on the 4th floor of a historic brownstone on Beacon Street, right in the heart of the legal district. It was a world away from the grit of the truck stop. High ceilings, crown moldings, and bay windows overlooking the frozen pond in the public garden. The air smelled of old books and expensive leather. Harper herself was younger than I expected, maybe 45. But she carried herself with the terrifying competence of a woman who had spent her career dismantling arrogance in Suffolk County courtrooms. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant bun, and she wore a navy suit that looked like armor. She didn't offer me tea or sympathy. She gestured to the heavy oak table in the center of her office. Show me, she said. I laid it all out. I placed the batteries on the table. Then the foreclosure notice. Then the folder Nora had given me. The emails, the bank transfers to Delaware, the photos of the cash handoffs. And finally, I opened the laptop I'd brought and played the video of Miranda Reeves, the actress in the wig, walking into my doctor's office. Harper watched it in silence. Her face was unreadable, a stone mask of concentration. She watched it twice. Then she picked up the handwritten ledger, the one with final solution pending written in Caleb's jagged scrawl. She stared at that line for a long time. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to get louder. Finally, she looked up at me. The mask dropped, just for a second, and I saw a flash of pure professional rage in her eyes. Mrs. Emerson, she said, her voice low and dangerous. I have prosecuted organized crime syndicates. I have sued pharmaceutical companies. I have seen greed in every form. But this, she tapped the ledger, this is not just greed. This is pathology. She pulled a yellow legal pad toward her and uncapped a pen. The medical fraud alone, hiring an imposter to falsify HIPAA records, is a federal offense that carries a 10-year minimum, she said, writing rapidly. The identity theft adds another 5. The embezzlement, given the amounts and the international transfers, is grand larceny and wire fraud. That's 20 years. She looked me in the eye. And the attempted murder, the carbon monoxide, the stove. If we can prove intent, Caleb is looking at a life sentence. And Eli, as a co-conspirator who knew and did nothing, is looking at 20 years as an accomplice. Can we prove intent? I asked. With this? She held up the ledger. A budget line item for your death? Yes, we can prove intent. She leaned forward. But I need you to understand what this means, Ruth. Once we pull this trigger, there is no going back. They will fight. They will try to destroy your character. They will try to use the very medical records they forged to claim you're incompetent and that this is all a paranoid delusion. They will try to paint you as the bitter, senile widow who can't let go of control. I looked at the batteries sitting on her polished table and thought about the smell of gas in my bedroom. Harper, I said softly, I'm already dead to them. I'm just making it official. She smiled then. It wasn't a warm smile. It was a shark smile. Good, she said. Then let's go to the police. We went to the Boston Police Headquarters that afternoon. Harper knew the chief of detectives. She bypassed the front desk and walked us straight into the Major Crimes Division. I spent 4 hours in a windowless interview room that smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. Two detectives, a seasoned older man named Miller and a younger woman named Gonzalez, listened as I walked them through the timeline of my own destruction. I told them about the headaches, the lost time, the gas, and the tape on the stove. When I showed them the video of the actress, Miller stood up and walked to the wall, running a hand over his face. "Jesus," he muttered. "That's cold." But it was the voicemail that sealed it. I hadn't played the final file for Harper yet. It was an audio file Nora had scraped from the company server, a voicemail Caleb had foolishly left on Eli's work extension, which automatically backed up to the cloud. I had been too afraid to listen to it until now. But in that room, under the fluorescent lights, I pressed play. The room went silent as Caleb's voice, tinny but unmistakable, filled the air. "Eli, pick up. We have a problem. The gas didn't work. She woke up too fast. The ventilation in that old house is too drafty. The concentration didn't get high enough. Next time, I won't leave it to chance. I won't just turn a knob and walk away. Next time, I'll have to stay until she stops breathing. We're running out of time on the foreclosure." Detective Gonzalez looked at Detective Miller, and Miller looked at me. "Stay until she stops breathing," Miller repeated. "That's an imminent threat." "That's conspiracy to commit murder," Harper corrected, "and it's a confession to the attempt." Miller nodded, sat down, and pulled a warrant application toward him. "We have enough," he said. "We have the actress, the financial trail, and the threat. I can get a warrant signed within the hour." "And the assets?" Harper asked. "We'll freeze everything," Miller promised. "If he tries to buy a pack of gum tomorrow morning, his card will decline." I walked out of the police station into the cool evening air. The sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows across the pavement. I felt lightheaded, drained, but also strangely weightless. The machinery of justice had been turned on. It was out of my hands now. "Go back to the motel," Harper told me. "Stay inside, lock the door, do not answer your phone. We're executing the warrant at dawn." I drove back to the Starlight Motor Inn, but I didn't go inside right away. Instead, I did something dangerous, something I needed to do for my own closure. I drove to the Seaport District. I parked my truck 2 blocks away from the luxury high-rise where Caleb lived, the building bought with the money he stole from the business. I sat in the darkness of the cab, watching the entrance. At 8 p.m., a sleek black town car pulled up. Caleb got out. He looked magnificent. He was wearing a tailored suit that probably cost $5,000. He was laughing, talking on his cell phone, and looking for all the world like a master of the universe. He walked with a bounce in his step, entering the glass lobby under the warm glow of the chandeliers. He looked happy. He had tried to kill his mother, had stolen her legacy, had erased her identity, and it didn't weigh on him at all. He wasn't haunted. He wasn't guilty. He was just happy, successful. I watched him get into the elevator, the doors sliding shut on his smiling face. I realized then that the son I loved was truly gone. The boy who used to hold my hand crossing the street, the boy I had sacrificed everything for, he had died a long time ago. The man in that elevator was a stranger, a parasite wearing my son's skin, and I didn't have to feel guilty about stopping a parasite. I started the truck and drove away, and I never looked back. The raid happened at 6 a.m. the next morning. I wasn't there to see it, but Detective Miller told me about it later with a grim satisfaction. A SWAT team breached the door of the penthouse condo in the Seaport. They found Caleb in his home office, still in his silk pajamas, frantically feeding documents into a shredder. Apparently, he had tried to check his offshore accounts that morning and found them locked. He had tried to transfer funds and gotten an access denied message. He knew the walls were closing in, but he didn't know how fast. When the police kicked down the door, he tried to run for the balcony, maybe to throw the laptop over, or maybe to hide something, but they tackled him before he got there. They found the final solution ledger in his safe, the burner phone he used to call the actress, and the receipts for the tape and the batteries. Nora had copied the files, but Caleb had kept the originals like trophies. His arrogance was his undoing. He was arrested on 14 counts: attempted murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, grand larceny, wire fraud, identity theft, and 4 counts of forgery. They led him out of the building in handcuffs, past the doorman he had tipped with stolen money, and past the neighbors he had impressed with his stolen success. Bail was set at $2 million. But it didn't matter, because Harper and Detective Miller had done their jobs perfectly. Every asset he owned, the condo, the cars, and the bank accounts, was frozen. He couldn't pay a bail bondsman and couldn't hire a dream team of defense lawyers. He was broke. They took him to the Nashua Street jail, processed him, and put him in a holding cell. Eli turned himself in 3 hours later. He walked into the precinct with a public defender, looking pale and terrified. He didn't wait for them to question him. He started talking immediately. He told them everything. He told them about the night I signed the papers in the storm, about the actress, and about Caleb cursing because the carbon monoxide didn't work fast enough. He tried to cut a deal and offered to testify against his brother in exchange for leniency. And just like that, the empire of lies they had built collapsed. It didn't take a war. It just took one mother who refused to stay dead. I sat in my motel room and watched the news report on the local station. Local restaurateur arrested in shocking matricide plot, the headline read. They showed Caleb's mugshot. He looked angry, not sad, not remorseful, just angry that he had been caught. I turned off the TV and picked up the photo of Gerald I kept on the nightstand. "We got him, Gerald," I whispered. "We got him." But the war wasn't over. The arrest was just the beginning. Now came the trial, the part where I had to stand in front of a jury, look my son in the eye, and tell the world what he did. I wasn't afraid. I had survived the gas. I had survived the betrayal. I would survive the truth. The reckoning arrived on a slate gray morning at the Suffolk Superior Court in downtown Boston, a building as imposing and stone-faced as the justice I was seeking. I walked up the granite steps, flanked by Harper Boone and a phalanx of reporters. The story had leaked, the chowder queen, whose sons tried to murder her for the inheritance, and the public was hungry for the details. But I didn't hide my face. I didn't wear sunglasses. I looked straight ahead, gripping my purse, because I had nothing to be ashamed of. Inside, the courtroom smelled of lemon polish and old anxiety. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low-grade headache frequency. I took my seat in the front row behind the prosecutor's table, smoothing my skirt, and waited. When they brought Caleb in, the air in the room changed. He wasn't the master of the universe anymore. He was wearing a suit that hung loosely on his frame, likely bought off the rack because his bespoke wardrobe had been seized. His hair, usually gelled to perfection, was dull. He looked tired, and he looked smaller. He sat at the defense table, flanked by 3 court-appointed attorneys because he could no longer afford the dream team. He refused to look at me and just stared straight ahead at the judge's bench, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping in his cheek. He was terrified that if he made eye contact with the mother he tried to murder, the jury would see the monster beneath the haircut. The trial lasted 3 weeks. It was a slow, methodical dismantling of a man's ego. The prosecution didn't scream. They didn't need theatrics. They simply laid out the puzzle pieces Harper and I had collected, one by one, until the picture was undeniable. First came Miranda Reeves, the actress. She took the stand looking terrified and was granted immunity in exchange for her testimony. She narrated the entire impersonation scheme. She told the jury how Caleb had paid her $15,000 in cash and how he had given her videos of me to study. Home movies Eli had secretly recorded at Thanksgiving so she could perfect my limp and my laugh. Then The prosecutor played the audio recording she had secretly made on her phone during their prep sessions. Caleb's voice filled the silent courtroom, arrogant and annoyed. You need to act demented, but not incompetent yet. We need a diagnosis of decline, not a vegetative state. I need her to be legally questionable, not legally dead. At least, not yet. Not yet. The jurors looked at Caleb. He stared at the table. Then came the financial forensic accountant. He put charts up on the screen showing the flow of money. He showed how Caleb had skimmed $340,000 from Emerson's table over 2 years, siphoning it into offshore accounts while telling me we needed to cut staff costs to stay afloat. He showed the final solution ledger. When that image hit the screen, my name next to a pending status, a gasp went through the gallery. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a project status update. But the final nail in the coffin was Eli. Watching my younger son take the stand against his older brother wasn't triumphant. It was tragic. It was the final shattering of the family Gerald and I had tried to build. Eli looked broken. He spoke in a whisper, wiping tears from his eyes as he narrated the conspiracy. He detailed everything. The night I signed the papers in the ice storm, the decision to remove the batteries from the detector, and the frustration when the carbon monoxide didn't work fast enough. Why? The prosecutor asked him gently. Why did you do it? Your mother gave you everything. Eli looked at me then. For the first time, his face crumpled with shame. Because Caleb said we deserved it, he whispered. He said she was just in the way. He said she was sitting on a gold mine and treating it like a soup kitchen, and that if we didn't take it, someone else would. And the stove? The prosecutor asked, leaning against the railing. Did you know he was going there that night? Eli looked down at his hands, twisting his wedding ring. Yes, I knew he was going over. He told me we were running out of time on the foreclosure, and he needed to clear the asset immediately. I told myself he was just going to sabotage the utilities, make the house unlivable so she'd have to move out. But that's not what he did, is it? The prosecutor continued. No, Eli whispered, tears finally spilling over. He called me afterwards. He wasn't talking about eviction. He was furious that the gas hadn't built up enough concentration, and he had said, next time, I won't just turn a knob and walk away. Next time, I'll stay until she stops breathing. The defense tried to cross-examine him. They tried to paint Eli as a liar, trying to save his own skin. They tried to paint me as a vindictive, confused old woman who had misunderstood business restructuring. But they couldn't explain the batteries in Caleb's pocket. They couldn't explain the actress, and they couldn't explain the voice on the tape. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. I sat in the hallway with Harper, drinking lukewarm coffee and waiting. I thought I would be nervous and that I would be pacing, but instead, I felt a strange and heavy calm. I had done my part. I had told the truth. When the bailiff called us back in, the courtroom was so silent you could hear the radiators hissing. The jury filed in. They didn't look at Caleb. That's how you know. If they look at the defendant, there's a chance. If they look at the floor, he's done. The forewoman, a middle-aged woman from Dorchester with sensible shoes and a face that had seen hard work, stood up holding the verdict form. In the matter of the Commonwealth versus Caleb Emerson, on the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, how do you find? Guilty, she said clearly. On the charge of elder abuse? Guilty. On the charge of grand larceny? Guilty. On the charge of identity theft? Guilty. 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 14 times she said the word. 14 times the hammer came down. Caleb didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just slumped in his chair, the air leaving him all at once, as if his arrogance had been the only thing holding him upright. The sentencing hearing happened 2 weeks later. The judge was a stern man who had presided over the trial with stone-faced neutrality. But during sentencing, he finally let his disgust show. He looked at Caleb over the rim of his glasses. Mr. Emerson, the judge said, his voice echoing in the chamber. You had every advantage. You had an education, you had a thriving family business, you had a mother who loved you. And instead of building on that legacy, you decided to cannibalize it. He paused. You treated your mother's life like a line item in a budget and tried to erase her to speed up your inheritance. That is a level of depravity this court rarely sees. He sentenced Caleb to 40 years in a state penitentiary. 40 years. He would be 73 years old when he got out and would spend the prime of his life in a cage, surrounded by men who didn't care about his business degree or his tailored suits. He would grow old in a concrete box, far away from the ocean and far away from the empire he tried to steal. Eli, for his cooperation and testimony, received 2 years of probation and a lifetime of shame. He moved to Ohio the week after the trial, and I haven't spoken to him since. As the bailiffs led Caleb away in handcuffs, he stopped at the door, turned and looked back at me one last time. His eyes were wide, terrified, and pleading. He looked like the little boy who used to wake up from nightmares and call for me. For a split second, my heart lurched. But then I remembered the gas. I remembered the tape on the stove, and I remembered the actress. I didn't look away. I held his gaze until they pushed him through the door and he disappeared. 4 months later, the civil suit settled. Harper Boone was as good as her reputation. She clawed back every asset she could. The condo in the seaport was sold. The luxury cars were auctioned, and the hidden accounts in Delaware were drained. Emerson's Table, the corporate entity, was dissolved. The Dallas locations were sold off to pay creditors. The brand was gone. But I kept one thing. I kept the deed to the original diner in Gloucester. And I kept enough capital to start over, on my own terms. 6 months after the sentencing, on a crisp morning in October, I stood in the kitchen of a small shingled cottage in Rockport, just a few miles up the coast, from where it all began. I had renamed it. It was no longer Emerson's Table anymore. It was now Ruth's Table. On the morning of the grand opening, I stood alone in the kitchen, savoring the silence before the rush. It was 4:47 in the morning. Outside, the Atlantic Ocean was black and restless, the wind rattling the sash windows just like it had 30 years ago. Inside, the kitchen was warm and bright. I reached for the flour and for the butter. The smell of yeast and salt air filled the room, a sensory memory that bridged the gap between the woman I was and the woman I had become. I started kneading the dough. My hands were older now. My knuckles were swollen with arthritis, but they were strong. They were the hands of a survivor. By 6:15, when I flipped the sign on the door to open, there was already a line of locals stretching down the block. They weren't there because I was famous. They weren't there because of the scandal, although that had certainly been the talk of the town for months. They were there because they knew. They knew that the scones were fresh. They knew the chowder was thick and hot. And they knew that the woman behind the counter had walked through the fire and come out the other side carrying a tray of biscuits. Wade, the trucker who had been my first customer 30 years ago, was retired now. But he walked through the door at 6:20, leaning on a cane. He sat at the counter, looked at me with those gentle eyes, and smiled. "Coffee, Ruth?" he asked. "Coming right up, Wade," I said. As I poured the coffee, watching the steam rise into the morning light, I looked at the new frame I had hung by the register. It wasn't a dollar bill this time. It was a photo of me and Nora, standing in front of the new sign, smiling. I thought about Caleb, waking up in a cell to the sound of a buzzer. I thought about the empire of lies he had tried to build. They had tried to make me invisible and to turn me into a ghost in my own life, a confused, demented old woman who could be easily erased. But as I looked around my bustling kitchen, listening to the clatter of silverware and the hum of conversation, I realized the truth. I wasn't a ghost. I was the foundation, the architect, and the woman who built the castle they tried to steal. And I was just getting started. You've made it to the end. You walked through the fire with Ruth. But I have to be honest, it breaks my heart when I see people listen to these stories, feel these heavy emotions, and then just walk away. No subscription, no support, just silence. It feels like I'm pouring my soul into a void, working days and nights to bring these voices to life, only to be met with ghost viewers. Please don't be another ghost. If this story kept you company, don't just take it and leave. You owe it to the story to leave a mark, a subscribe, a super thanks, or even just commenting your city. Tell me where in the world you are listening from. Let me know exactly where my voice is traveling so I know I'm not alone in this. And if you aren't ready to leave yet, don't. There are 2 more real-life journeys right here on your screen. Pick one. Stay with me a little longer. Don't let the silence win. Until next time.